Our webinar for today is going to be Don't Take Chances with Your Healthcare Network. And this is actually a really key a key topic because, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in this industry, as in on the healthcare side, on public sector up here in Canada, and to try to designing things and to think about different scenarios and getting it right and talk about helping those first responders. But what we do have is we have two great guests here today.
We do.
Got one. We do, don't we? Don't we, Tony? And
really
I'm your
excited.
sidekick, Stu, by the way. So sorry for that. Hi, I'm your sidekick, Stu, and I'm joined by my host, Tawny. And Tawny, why don't you introduce our two esteemed guests here that have joined us today?
I'm actually, I want them to introduce themselves. You know, these are two folks who've been in the healthcare world a long time, two household names, and we're really excited on different ends of the spectrum, different sides of delivery, different sides of the business in healthcare. But Todd, why don't we start with you? I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Wilfred Todd Smith. I have been in wireless industry for about 12 years now, specializing in healthcare. And I've worked in several different healthcare systems, in one of the largest healthcare systems in northern Michigan, as well as a very amazing healthcare system in Memphis, Tennessee that deals with catastrophic children's illnesses. And now I find myself in Portland, Oregon, working for one of the esteemed healthcare organizations in this area. I've been very lucky with that. Had a lot of great experiences and hopefully make a difference. I think that one thing that I always like to bring to the table when I think about healthcare is that, you know, a lot of our workers, it's something that really means a lot to me. A lot of my coworkers and family members are treated at the facilities that I work. And so, and I have been a critical patient at one of the facilities that I worked at. So it really brings it home that the work that we do directly supports the caregivers. And in a lot of cases, they can't perform their jobs without good wireless connectivity for their IV pumps and their PDAs and their WVoIP phones and so on. So it really brings it home.
Absolutely. And speaking of things like monitoring and the devices that are in facilities, Brian, we have Brian Long on the line. Brian, welcome. Do you want to take a minute and introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you. My name is Brian Long. I'm the Vice President of Global Professional Services and Education at a medical device company called Masimo. We make patient monitors that touch all different areas of the hospital. In my past life, I have a clinical background as serving in the Rhode Island National Guard as an airborne medic. I also worked in a hospital for several years performing sleep diagnostic testing on patients, and then have been involved with wireless and healthcare devices in some way, shape, or form for over the last, about 12 or 13 years now. So it's been an interesting journey being able to see both sides of both the clinical side and the technical side, and being able to offer different types of solutions to folks out there in the front lines in the hospitals.
That's fantastic. And so folks, I think you can see why we're so excited. What a wealth of knowledge that we have here with Todd and Brian. So thank you to the two of you being willing to come on and talk to us. I know this is a really critical, really busy time for you both. So we'll make sure we're mindful, but thanks again for joining us. So today we just did our intros, but today we're really going to dive into understanding the requirements for your network. So Todd, I'm going to start with you. Why don't you just kind of walk us through the typical requirements in a healthcare facility, and then how you modify that during times of emergencies and things like that. So why don't we just kind of talk through some of those initial thoughts?
Wow, unpacking that, some of the requirements that I design for in healthcare systems are really derived from some of the best practices that were released from Cisco and Apple. Also in exploring the sensitivity of the iPhone client. So what I've found over the score of the last couple of years is that more and more healthcare facilities have this grail idea of one device for their nurses, because the nurse, a common complaint with the caregivers is, I have too much stuff to carry around. I need to concentrate on giving and providing care to my patients and not carrying a bat belt of equipment around with me. So they want to have a single device that can do barcode scanning, secure text messages, paging and email, and also access their patient information to the EMR, or the electronic medical record system, such as Cerner or whatever, Meditech. And so what I've found over the last year and a half, working for the medical facility in Memphis, Tennessee, was that we wanted to use the iPhone 8 as the client. And if you look at some of the resources and take measurements of the sensitivity of the iPhone 8, it's not a very sensitive device. So you need to adjust your design to account for that most important, least capable client for your network. So typically I like to design a negative 65 dBm as heard from an iPhone 8 for your primary cell edge, and then negative 70 for a secondary, tertiary, and sometimes above that, depending upon the density. So that really produces very small cells within the hospital, much smaller than I was traditionally used to at the beginning of my Wi-Fi career.
You know, and that actually brings up a good one. Sorry, Tony. Even on the when you talk about small cells, that also plays into other devices like patient location type or Vocera badges, right, or other type of voice grade type devices as well. So creating those small cells is definitely something.
Absolutely, and I think that if you can make the iPhone work, everything else will come together too. Now, I mean, you should have a 5 gigahertz only WLAN for that device. You should turn on adaptive QoS techniques such as Cisco's Fastlane, you know, things like that. But it definitely should reduce your WLAN sprawl as small as possible, no more than 4 SSIDs. All the good practices that we've talked about and EKAHAU's talked about over and over the last couple of years.
Well,
Brian,
and I think one of the things I was going to, before Brian interjects, or if he wants to, I was just going to say, I think it's one of the things that I think is key that you hit is designing for your most important but least capable device. And so that's something, especially during emergencies, you need to make sure you do. Because if the least capable device is your most important device, if it's a pager or whatever the case may be, you've got to make sure that that will function on the network, right? And then you hit the nail on the head. I was gonna say, he's jumping through my slides. Man, Todd is like on point today. Talking about 5 gigahertz, well, designing in 5 gigahertz. I mean, especially because of all of the interference, how important that is to have the 5 gigahertz coverage in your network. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, all the things that we typically talk about for good Wi-Fi design, make sure you disable the 802.11b data rates so that you get those old clients off to preserve the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum as much as possible. Because the truth of the matter for healthcare is that you're going to have some 2.4 gigahertz only medical devices. So you'll have a medical device WLAN that might do 82.1x with EAP TLS, but more than likely it'll be a PSK type of security, and it's going to have to be dual frequency. So you need to preserve that as much as possible. One of those ways is to take the corporate WLAN for the laptops and so on, and have that a dual purpose for your iPhone 8s, for your clinical mobility type voice application, but also your corporate laptops, and make that 5 gigahertz only. So that's some of the things that you can help do to help decrease your WLAN sprawl, as well as preserve the 2.4 gigahertz frequency as much as possible for your medical devices.
So Todd, someone had a question, and I'm going to pose this to you. So Chad Reed asks us, in most industrial networks, the actual data rates are fairly small as a lot of information is text-based. What is the typical load with medical over wireless? So he's faced with a situation where they may be tasked to set up some triage tents for medical facilities. Curious on the speed and the data rates for medical typically. What do you plan for? What are your thoughts on that? What is your standard?
So what my Todd's best practice is that I disable all data rates, all 802.11b data rates, right? So, and then for a mandatory or basic rate, I'll make that 12, and also have a 9 data rate as supported. So everything below 9 would be disabled, 9 would be supported, 12 would be mandatory. Now that's on 2.4, and then 5 gigahertz also, everything below 9 is disabled, and have 9 as supported and 12 as a mandatory. Now I have seen or I've heard of other people that suggest higher mandatory data rates and everything else below disabled. And that would be great if you have the density and the validation to be able to do that. But I've found that that in my designs for my hospital systems with the clients that I use, I feel comfortable with using 12 megabits per second as the mandatory data rate, with 9 as supported.
That's a good rule. That's a good rule of thumb. So another challenge that you have, especially in hospital facilities, is roaming and reliable roaming within the facility. Do you find that if you're setting up like triage tents, you're setting up additional things outside, that how are you accommodating roaming in that regard?
So the triage tents, that's a really interesting topic, and just one that just has come up, not necessarily with roaming with triage tents, but with the triage tents and the mobile testing sites in general. I mean, 2 weeks ago, we were just starting to think, oh, well, maybe we need to have these types of things. So typically, or at least in my experience with my healthcare facility that I'm building out right now, we didn't have some of the equipment and design and POC put in place for like a mobile mesh, which would be really cool, right? To get those tents way far in the parking lot, you could have some sort of Yagi antenna as the route access point, link back to a series of portable mesh antennas. And that's something I want to work on in the future, so that for COVID-20, we can be prepared. But for COVID-19, what we're doing is we are running Cat5 or fiber, and we have the overflow, the ED overflow tents or the surge tents right near the ED entrance. And then the mobile testing sites also within reach of either fiber or copper run. Typically in the MRI Bay Area or other turnaround areas where the cars can come in and then drive off after they're tested. And I do put it, Terry said something in the chat, I just saw it pop up. I do put the AP in the tent itself. And typically, or I'm saying that too much today, I'm sorry.
No,
because it's not, it's anything but typical. But I have—
this scenario is absolutely not typical.
Yes. I have been putting 1 AP per tent segment. I measured a tent the other day because of some interesting feedback on Twitter about the possible insulation like Mylar or other metallicized fabric. And I found that the tent that I'm using right now is 4 dB attenuation. So about double that of typical steel stud and drywall wall.
That's interesting. That's really good, interesting, and able to find out what that is, because it's probably different in certain types of tents, right? You could have, and I'm wondering if there's even difference in the tents, maybe that the military is using, right? Or different, because not everybody's going to use the same type of material. So you have to kind of take in consideration of, hey, not all structures may be the same out there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk more about some of the triage tents and the temporary facilities here a little bit when we talk about some use cases. But let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about some of the response systems, some of the patient monitoring systems. Brian, the man, right?
Yes.
The man, the myth, the legend.
So one of the primary use cases that we work in the healthcare facilities is delivering continuous real-time patient monitoring to clinicians on floors, and then sending alarms and alerts to clinicians that are carrying some type of mobile device, whether it be a Cisco phone, a SpectraLink phone, a Vocera badge, or any other type of communication device. The biggest thing for us is, when you're talking about requirements, having the continuous data definitely brings out any type of challenges that you may or might not even know exist in your Wi-Fi network. When I think of healthcare environments and use cases and those types of things, it's, everything that you do in your home plus some, right? So there's going to be gaming, there's going to be large file downloads, there's going to be emails, there's going to be voice over IP, and then continuous patient monitoring, and then you've got location tracking and all of those different types of things. So for us, one of the things that was just mentioned is, the type of data that's being sent. So I know, for example, for our applications, depending on how many different types of waveforms you're sending, we're sending at about 25 kilobits to 50 kilobits per device per second. So fortunately, the data overhead is very low, but obviously it's time sensitive. So then not only is it the ability to deliver the data, it's also the application sensitivity as well. So, through our experiences, we've been able to, tune, for example, application settings if necessary, as long as things are understood on both sides, on both the technical and the clinical impact of that. But for us, it's really about real-time patient monitoring, leveraging existing wireless infrastructures in the hospital, because the hospital has already made a significant investment in that infrastructure. And having to put in a proprietary network or another type of dedicated system, obviously that's more money, more overhead, and more management. So we try to leverage the existing WLAN infrastructure as much as possible. We also try to be as pragmatic as well. So taking into the account of, what is the use case for the patient? So for example, if you're going to have medical devices that are mounted to the wall and they're not going to move, then, unless there's facility requirements that require that you have wireless, hardwire those, but if you have patients that are going to be walking around and you need to have monitoring, there's a lot of initiatives, for example, on post-operative orthopedic floors. So like a hip replacement, a knee replacement, or what have you, that the patients need to get up within the first 24 hours to start being mobile to enhance their recovery. So then a mobile type of monitoring is necessary because they're walking around with a physical therapist or occupational therapist. And even though they're with a clinician, they still want to record that data to see how the patient's responding. So having the ability to have continuous data streaming across that network, making all the optimizations that Todd had mentioned with data rates and capacity planning and those types of things are definitely crucial for real-time patient monitoring and delivering alerts to clinicians.
That's, it's interesting, Brian, hearing you talk about the demand. So what happens if the infrastructure that's already in place can't support the new monitoring systems? Like, what is your recommendation? Todd's like, it's like this, it's like, so what is your recommendation?
It's a lot of finger pointing, right?
Right.
Yeah, Yeah, you guys are 100% right. And you know, for what we do, to be perfectly honest, is we try to leverage, you know, we have internal tools and diagnostics, because fortunately in our situation, we control both sides. We control both the client and the server. So we have the ability to monitor the performance on both sides of that. But we also leverage, obviously, you know, the great tools that you guys provide at EKAHAU to be able to show the data of what's really happening in the environment. So, you know, there's a lot of cases we have where, you know, the coverage is perfectly fine. There's no issues. But it's a configuration issue. You know, session time is a big one. You know, default WLANs in Cisco have a 30-minute session timeout. Well, if you're knocking off every medical device every 30 minutes to re-authenticate and sending alarms to clinicians, that's going to be a nuisance to them. And nuisance alarms is at the top of patient health hazards for ECRI Institute. So there's a lot of configuration things, you know, that we try to work with the hospitals, and we just try to use the data, you know, to say, look, this is what's happening. You know, we want to partner with you and work together to gain an understanding on how we can solve this. It's not, we do get a lot of, you know, that back and forth for sure, but we try to use the data, and we try to target the key stakeholder for the network, right? We want to ensure that we are working with them in a partnership to start with, versus, you know, getting on a project call with executive leadership, and that's the first time everyone's hearing of it. That is not the way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely right. So I have a few just housekeeping questions. You know, you guys are sparking a lot of really good questions from the attendees, and so thoughts on to both Todd and Brian. Todd, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts on utilizing the Uni 2C band extended channels in hospitals?
Yeah, so that's a really good topic, and I think it's really a deep one. I think it's great to use the Uni 1, Uni 3, and Uni 2 frequency bands. But it really comes down to life cycle. And what I've seen is that life cycle, it can be, doesn't have to be, but it can be a challenge for different healthcare organizations, especially ones that I've traditionally worked at have been not-for-profit. And so it might have, different organizations might have a different ability to acquire capital versus OpEx type funding. And so life cycle for the devices is critical. A few years back, I had a chance to engage a customer that their WOWs, their workstation on wheels, were disconnecting horribly throughout the healthcare organization. And it turned out to be they were using an ASUS Wi-Fi dongle on their WOWs, and it just would not support anything but the Uni 1 and Uni 3 frequency bands, and not even all the channels in the Uni 3. So, you know, you have to dig into that and work with the other business units within that organization as much as possible. It's a challenge, right? Because the organizations don't typically have a strong life cycle for client devices because it's very expensive. So you can create a state-of-the-art wireless infrastructure, but if your clients are down here, you're not going to be able to leverage that infrastructure. So you need to sort of maintain a stepping stone or stairway type pattern, right? The clients have to be sufficiently life cycled. The infrastructure has to be sufficiently life cycled. It has to go up together as a partnership. And so that's really, really challenging.
Yeah, that's very challenging.
But I think to the point, if you want a wireless network to be able to support the type of clinical mobility with the iPhone devices as a one tool type, the real-time patient monitoring, especially mobile monitoring, you really need to be able to leverage the Uni 1, Uni 2, and Uni 3 frequency bands with 802.11 RKNV.
Yeah, I've had interesting experience with even small Motorola handhelds that would be used for medication dispensing, and not by default don't use Uni 2E at all, right? They're just Uni 1 and that's it. And so, and a lot of times you get a hospital that is completely 5 gig and they say, oh great, we can use all the channels, and then all of a sudden a whole whack of devices can't even use them, right? And it's like,
yeah, you can't use all the channels.
Right? And it's like, we need to dispense medicine, and then you got to go back and say, hey, can you guys enable that? And sometimes there's a lot of things that don't happen, or you know what? And I'm sure, I know Brian and you and I talked about this one point, where is that there's a lot of machines and things that are made for medical purposes that have to be FDA approved, and there's usually a long life cycle in order for whatever you put in that device has to be FDA, and you can't change it. And so sometimes you have to put in an older type card, and it's got to stay in there for that life cycle because it can't change.
Yeah, I think that's really, I mean, that might be just dependent on the manufacturer themselves and maybe how they're doing their submissions or what have you. I know from our experience, you know, when you make a submission to the FDA, and this is specific to the United States, so I apologize for our international listeners, but when you make a submission to the FDA, you are put forth what's called the intended use of the device. The intended use is typically some type of medical type of monitoring, drug delivery, like if you're doing infusion pumps or what have you. The methods of communication is kind of like, so quote unquote, like an accessory. So if you make a change, for example, to a component within the medical device, basically you go through a checklist from the FDA on, you know, are you required to do a new submission or what's called a letter to file? And, you know, there are specific rules that say you have to do a completely new submission. And there's rules that say you just do a letter to file, which is basically just an update. So something that you could get done maybe in, you know, a 30-day cycle versus, you know, a many month cycle. So I know, for example, on our approach, if we've got to make updates to like the communication mechanisms and those types of things, it's not changing the indications of use for our device. So we've been able to rapidly do things. You guys are talking about, for example, 5 gig band. You know, we actually have the ability to turn on and off individual channels. You know, we can turn off our 2.0 gigahertz altogether on our client, and those types of things to try to, quote unquote, be the best client we can be on the infrastructure. So yeah, there definitely are obviously FDA requirements, and obviously I am not an FDA expert, so please consult your own FDA experts. But from my experience, it's like I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV.
Hey, so I'm practicing wireless, so.
So, throwing the FDA up there as kind of a reason why there's not an update to a communication part of your device. It might vary by different manufacturers, but I know for our experience, we've been able to make rapid enhancements based on how we've done our submissions.
Well, that's good to know. That's good to know that things can change and move along and adapt. That's really reassuring. So that's definitely good.
So we're going to talk specifically about, and we've talked a lot about just the healthcare networks in general. So we're going to talk about some of the deployments, some of the temporary deployments that Todd, you've seen, and you've been involved in some of that. So why don't you share with us kind of what's going on? And so folks, these are real pictures that Todd had provided to us that we can include of some of the things that he's working on right now in these emergency situations type.
Yep. So we have a lot of, this is unprecedented times with the COVID-19, and it's a moving target. We've had to.
It depends?
Yes, Sam. Yes, Sam, it does depend. But I think that any one day the target might shift, like, oh, is this location good? Oh, well, we really want this location. Oh, well, maybe over here. So it's been very challenging. But in the two pictures that you see right here, the left picture in the parking lot is a drive-through testing site for COVID that we put together. It has several different bays. Cars will be able to drive in. The patients will, or the prospective patients will, hopefully not patients, hopefully they're just fine, right?
Yeah.
But they will be able to stay in their cars, limiting exposure to the healthcare workers to, for them to be swabbed and then their samples to be tested. Now, hopefully there will be tests available that can do that very rapidly. But right now it does take some time. So they would take their saliva swab or their whatever and have to send it to a lab to get tested for the COVID virus. On the other side of the coin, in the mobile testing is very, very important, right? We want to try to isolate the virus and know who has it and if they need to quarantine and so on. On the right-hand side, you see a surge tent. Now, these tents will be for in the event that the ED becomes overrun and things like that. So they will actually house patients. And this is just an example. Now, that particular tent is the one that I tested with about a 4 dBm loss or attenuation through the fabric, about twice the attenuation of a steel-studded gypsum wall. So that's something to take into consideration. And I have heard that some other tents have even more attenuation. I saw a picture by a fellow Wi-Fi engineer that working from another hospital system. I believe it was Tim O'Hara. I'm not sure. I could find out. But he said that he tested and he pulled back a section of a tent and it looked like a mylar or metallicized fabric. He said it was about a 10 dBm loss. So, you know, this really, that's
10.
severe, right? I mean, that's a lot. So you need to probably put an AP per tent segment, and then also test, you know, measure the fabrics, and that's where things like the EKAHAU Sidekick comes into really good use case to help test that, or the NetScout G2.
Shame on you, Todd.
We like to call that brand X. So,
all right,
but that company doesn't exist anymore.
Brand X.
Yes.
Or even a client device to help test the attenuation of the fabric so that you know what the experience might be. But yeah.
And so not to put a product placement in there, but I know that I think we have a tool called the Analyzer that can actually help you out determine that.
Wait, what?
Right?
Wow.
We do.
Good segue. Maybe you can.
Yep. Is where you can actually, so folks, if you want to do exactly what Todd was saying, is you could actually pull up the Analyzer on your iPhone or iPad and connect your trusty Sidekick to it, like, you know, your Sidekick. Connect that right up to it, and it'll help you display exactly what the Sidekick is seeing. And you can also use a device off test to see what the actual iPad is actually seeing, or iOS device. It's a really cool tool. And not to segue, but I think that's a really kind of cool tool on the spot. So if you got a Sidekick and you need to understand what that loss is, do that. That's the best way to see it, because you don't have to bring your notebook out. Now you're not worried about, you know, swabbing down your notebook, because it's easy to clean your phone, right? It's hermetically sealed, just like your Sidekick is. It's hermetically sealed, right? So easy to swab down and clean. So that's a cool thing. But that's interesting. A 10 dB, that is amazing. I mean,
now to be fair, I did not measure it and I did not see it in person. I did measure the tent and it was a 4 dBm loss. Now all these tents, well, the pictures that you see are very the same tent manufacturer, or even the same tent, but in the future slide you'll see a different style tent. So every tent manufacturer or even tent design could potentially be a different attenuation loss. So think about placing 1 AP per tent segment. You should be fine. You know, take advantage of some of the things such as RF profiles and AP groups to limit the WLANs that you're broadcasting out of those tents. Things like that would
There's a great question, wasn't there, Tony, about that, about having APs in the tent there? I think
that's exactly where I was going to, because if you have a 10 dB loss, you're going to have your AP inside the tent, because you're going to have to adjust channel power or AP power. And so I understand the, you're worried about infectious disease and control and all of those other things. But I think in certain scenarios, that's just what you're going to have to do, because there's no right or wrong answer realistically. And if you have to do what you have to do to get the coverage to meet the requirements for your network, for what your current demand is, right?
And I think also that's another segue into that same question that I was noticing there, is that people are worrying about infectious diseases on the actual equipment itself.
Right.
Well, I mean, there are plenty of vendors out there that make enclosures where you can actually take I'm not saying put an internal AP outside, but in this case scenario, you might just have to, because if you got a bunch of them in stock, use them, right? Put an enclosure around them. But if you have the outdoor AP, you can always scrub that down, right? It's, put it in. But I wouldn't be too worried about that particular piece. You've got a lot of other things to worry about.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, and you can also just, excuse me, leave that AP up there for 7 days or 3 to 7 days, and everything will die off of it anyway. But yeah.
So let's look at some of the inside stuff. So obviously this is a very different tent, very different type of structure than the ones we just saw.
Yep. So this is another surge tent, ideally for in the case of additional beds and patient treatment area. I did not measure the attenuation of this tent. This is a tent in progress. But it does definitely look like a different type of fabric, not as heavy, and it's one big open area. So I'll probably place one AP and test it in this area toward the center. And if you notice the nice, I don't want to say gantry, but support structure, plan to hang the AP with zip ties on that. So that should be perfectly fine.
So I'm going to switch gears real quick. Brian, before we started recording, folks, Brian was sharing a use case that came up talking about timing out on the network. Brian, can you share a little bit about that and what the recommendation would be for timing out on a guest network?
Yeah, so one of the things we're seeing is obviously with the situation that we're in today, hospitals are struggling with the fact that they're going to see a huge increase in census and are going to have to expand their inpatient monitoring to areas where they don't do inpatient monitoring today. And solutions are being made available to these institutions that allow sensors to connect to a mobile device, which then is going to connect up to a cloud application. I know for one, we're definitely doing that for sure. So one of the things that we're running into is, all of a sudden data would be stopped updating, in the application. And what we're finding is in some cases, the patients are actually connected to the guest network, and the guest network portal timeouts are basically disconnecting them after a period of time. And that is just, one of these new use cases. There's so many reasons to do that. To do the timeouts, DHCP leasing and all of those different types of things. But now there's a big twist on, how are those devices going to be managed on the network? For me to make a recommendation, as far as the timeouts go, it's hard for me because I might not understand every single reason that they're doing it. But if you look at the use case of wanting to get this data up to a portal for clinicians to triage the patients, because the other thing we're hearing is, for my military background, it's like, you're getting like a mass, in the military, it would be a mass casualty situation. Unfortunately, this is, hopefully we're not getting that far, but you're getting a mass sickness or morbidity patient population coming in. And if you've got 600 patients that you're monitoring, how do you focus on, maybe the top 50? So getting that data up there is going to be extremely important. So for institutions that are actually expanding monitoring using these types of applications, there's going to have to be a new consideration on these types of captive portal timeouts to take into account those use cases for sure.
Yeah, that's, you know, it's an interesting thought. During emergencies, honestly, everything changes. Your capacity requirements are changing. Your demand is changing. Just strictly like what you're talking about, Brian. You've got to change what the typical role is, because you can't necessarily have that timeout piece, because there's so many other factors that are in play there. So, yeah, that's it's pretty crazy. And folks, one quick thing. Yes, this recording will be available. We will send out a link to it after the webinar for everybody who has registered today. I know a couple folks had to jump off. And then 2, we'll also have contact info for Brian and for Todd that you guys can ask questions. I know, wave to the camera. And so wanting to make sure, I know we do try to get to all of your questions. There's some really fantastic questions, and we're also grateful that everybody, our attendees, help respond and answer some of those questions. So let's specifically look at this, Todd. The inside. This is another one of the triage tents.
Nope. Yes, this is a surge tent.
Surge tent.
Yep. And you can see it's still in construction. And you can see straight ahead, I guess on the right-hand side, you'll see the doorway that leads to the other tent segment. So beyond the doorway, there's like this little hallway that's maybe 6-8 feet, and then you'll have another door and then another tent segment. Back to the captive portal and timeout issue. My personal best practice is to not do captive portals, to make the guest experience as seamless as possible, and then also have a long timeout, but yet a short DHCP lease of maybe 1 hour. And so that typically lets people get on and get off the guest network without having to be worried about being timed out. But every health system could potentially be different according to their individual needs, right?
Another quick question that's come up a couple times. A couple folks have asked about channel width, the recommended channel width. You know, my thought, I would say, and, you know, obviously I'm not as experienced as Todd or Brian here, but 20 megahertz channels, right? 40 if necessary. But Todd, what do you typically say in regards to the healthcare networks?
Right. So you'll see a lot of different advice toward that. And most of the people, or a lot of the people in the industry, will say 20 megahertz channel in an enterprise, 40 if you can prove that you have a sufficient reuse. In the medical vertical, I like to stick with just 20 megahertz channels.
20 megahertz.
I'd rather have that capacity. And in some high density areas, such as conference rooms and so on, I might take advantage of the flexible radio to have dual 5 gigahertz channels, and so on.
Gotcha.
But yeah, 20 megahertz channels for me is what I like to see. But again, if it's an office environment and you have sufficient channel reuse, then like an all wireless office, maybe you go with 40 megahertz channels. But I like to have that channel reuse and that capacity.
You know, in times of
the 20 megahertz channels.
Yeah, no, that's in times of these kind of like scenarios. When you look at it, it's there's going to be a lot of concerns for security. We need to design for security in this respect, and we're extending the wireless coverage out to the parking lots, out to places that maybe hospitals or healthcare never done before. And how do we, you know, what do we say to you know, because we have to, in these times, there's always going to be somebody who's going to want to take advantage of situations, right? You know, what's your thoughts on the security aspect of it for on the planning side?
So that's where the AP groups and RF profiles come into play. Now you have to understand that these are very quick targets, right? So you're not going to have a lot of time to engineer something new. So hopefully your wireless network, your wireless infrastructure is already optimized with appropriate levels of security. So hopefully you're using, for your corporate WLANs and hopefully the medical WLANs, you're using 82.1x with EPTLS. But that will also depend on a very strong MDM component, typically owned by another group. So you might have to rely upon PSKs and so on. Security obviously is very concerning. Only broadcast the SSIDs that you need out in the tents. You don't need to broadcast your whole suite of services. If you only need a clinical, laptop, then only broadcast your laptop. Typically, I would also broadcast a guest network. And you can help mitigate the security concerns with the guest network with different techniques, maybe a layer 2 ACL or a layer 3 ACL, and maybe tunneling those guest connections to an anchor controller and so on. If the healthcare facility has the capabilities of using device profiling, that's a great way to do it. But not every healthcare facility has a profiling agent in place. Not all of them can afford that type of investment, both in money as well as FTE time. So, but specifically, the easy win is to use an AP group to only broadcast the services that you need. I thought there was a really interesting question in the panel about fault tolerance in this situation, and it's a really good consideration, right? Typically in healthcare, you want primary and secondary and possibly even tertiary coverage in certain areas. And typically you would get that almost by default if you have a wireless design designed for an iPhone or for clinical mobility or for a robust real-time monitoring solution. And hopefully Brian can talk a little bit about some of that as well. But the feed, the backhaul is going to be a single switch in the tent, right? So you're not going to have the capability of having the same fault tolerance that you would have in the ICU, in the ED, or in the other areas of the hospital. So I would not go crazy with that. I wouldn't re-engineer or engineer anything new. Take your off-the-shelf technology and adapt it for these tents, and then learn from this. And go back and say, hey, management, I think I want to do a POC for some sort of mesh, mobile mesh, with using a Wi-Fi stand and a tripod and things like that. So the next time we run into this, we can have some additional capability.
So I know that we're getting close to time, and we've got some hard stops for folks, and I want to make sure we have an opportunity for our guests to kind of wrap up and have some last thoughts. So we'll start with Brian. Brian, what any specific tips? I mean, I know of course we've got to have an emergency response plan. You've got to make sure you're accommodating the increased capacity on your network, those type of things. But what any specific tips for folks during emergency situations, or if for your healthcare network in general, that we can leave with our attendees today?
Yeah, I think in response to emergency situations specifically, I think all of us, or all of the amazing Wi-Fi engineers that are out there and network engineers that are out there, you want to always abide by your best practices. You know, things that we talked about with fault tolerance and redundancies and all of that stuff. I think at the end of the day, in an emergency situation, you've got to look at what is the problem you're trying to solve and what is the cost of not having something available, versus potentially something bad happening. Like, okay, I put one AP and I can get it, but if that AP goes down, you're done. Well, maybe monitoring that patient or a physician be able to communicate with someone outside of an infection control area. Maybe that use case trumps the fact that, okay, we're willing to take this risk because, you know, this is what the situation calls for. So those are different types of situations, I think, that folks are being put into now. And it's very uncomfortable, especially when you're used to your best practices for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, you've got to make a decision on, is the cause worth taking the risk versus, potentially every single thing that can go wrong, because we can certainly beat solutions to death and then nothing ever gets deployed. But of course, you want to try to stick to your best practices for fault tolerance, for security, for all of your best practices on deployment, but also take into consideration what job you're trying to do in this emergent situation. And it's going to be temporary. It's not going to be permanent.
Yeah, absolutely.
God willing.
Todd, yeah, right. Let's cross our fingers and hope. Todd, what about you? What are some tips and that we haven't covered yet that in your mind that you think are really important for folks to know?
So I guess the two thoughts that I hope everyone comes away with are
Mm-hmm.
take care of yourself. I mean, that's number one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both for your sake and the patient's sake. Like I have to go on
Mm-hmm.
to the different hospitals and different COVID tents and so on to do certain
Mm-hmm.
things. Hopefully I won't have to go into a COVID area once it's set up. But
Mm-hmm.
if I do, I don't want to bring any germs into those very vulnerable patients. And I surely don't want to take anything away. So it's not just first responders and nurses and doctors at risk. It's also IT support, desktop engineering, all the people that make this stuff work. Take care of yourselves, take care of your family, and be flexible. So you have to be flexible in these times. You might not be able to get the exact solution that you want. Like for example, yesterday, we had to run a cable out to, well, you had a picture of it, the sort of military looking surge tent. We strung a rope from the building out to the tent down a pole and zip tied the Cat5 cable out over the rope from the building to the pole and then down to the tent. That surely is not the best practice way to deploy Cat5. But it is temporary and it is necessary. And if you want to think of it, it's fit for purpose for what it's designed to do for the period of time that it's necessary.
Yeah, and I think aesthetics in this time is they're not too worried. Anyone's not too worried about aesthetics or things like that. Or flexibility is absolutely important in this time. Well, with that, folks, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Brian and Todd, thank you extremely from the bottom of our hearts for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today and talk to us about some of these things, especially in light of obviously what's happening. It's critical for us to be flexible. It's critical for us to have a really good understanding of how our networks change and what we need to do to adapt to accommodate that. Folks, if you have questions, Brian and Todd have willingly given their information. Yes. And so we appreciate them sharing with us. So if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to them. Please reach out on Twitter. And I know both Brian and Todd would be more than happy to answer any additional questions. And if we did not get to your questions, we are sorry. We will make sure we have this recording available for everybody. And with that said, thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. And thanks, everyone, for joining around the world. Stay safe out there, guys.
Yeah.
Stay safe.
All right. Yeah, it's crazy.